So let's get into it for a little bit and say, you know, we're living in interesting times. The Chinese proverb that, or the Chinese curse that says you should live in interesting times, I think is about not being able to sleep at night. Many of you will know what that's all about. But let me just paint a picture of where we exactly are. So the world's population in 1980 stood at 6.5 billion, and 40% of them lived in cities. By 2080, 100 years later, the world's population will stand at 9.5 billion, and 80% of them will be living in cities. So a massive trek of half of humanity towards urban settlements is happening. And anybody who lives here in Australia knows this very, very well. This is in your media every day. It's not talked about as urbanisation, but it's talked about the emptying out of the regional towns. It's talked about the massive growth of Melbourne and Sydney, the difficulty in managing growth. It talks about southeast Queensland. It's about, you know, the metropolitan Perth agenda and all of that. So this transition of people to cities is an interesting phenomena that kind of underpins everything else that's going on. Now, other things being equal, cities and urbanisation are really good for us, and I won't take you through all of the evidence from all of the learned organisations that says cities are good. Cities make businesses more productive, they make people more entrepreneurial, they're better ways of using resources, they tend to promote social mobility when left to their own devices, they're good at creating, as it were, concentrations of people in order to provide amenities and services and other things. So when urbanisation works, it's absolutely fantastic. And every country in the world that you can identify that's gone through a process of increasing the average levels of wealth, the standard of living of its people, is nearly always associated with urbanisation. Urbanisation is the thing that makes societies grow and evolve and develop. But as you know, I think, this given of urbanisation that's now happening, being supported, of course, by digital technologies, which we'll come to in a minute, can have different kinds of outcomes. The unintended consequences of urbanisation, if the cities are not ready for the growth that they receive, can be congestion, inflation, crime, poor air quality, pollution, all of those other things. So if you like, the quest is not about whether to have urbanisation or not. It's how to get good urbanisation rather than bad urbanisation, putting it at its most simple. The good news is that part of that quest today is also about how to use a new generation of exponential technologies. As we're now more than 40 years into this urban century, we're in the middle phase of it, a new set of digital technologies and other kinds of science and technology that I'll talk about shortly arrive as a new set of tools with which to try to manage urbanisation. And of course, in a minute, you'll hear me talk all about the climate emergency and how, as it were, the quest of our time is to use the urbanisation process coupled with the new tools coming from technology to achieve a good urbanisation which is good for the planet. That's the space we're in. Now, if you think about where we've got to in this middle part of the urban century, what you begin to see is not, as it were, one type of city emerging, but many different types of cities emerging. But the key thing here is that what we've tried to do is to use more or less the 635 different benchmark studies of cities that exist, crunch them all through an algorithm to produce a distribution map to show you which cities are most like each other. So this includes all of the data that you're used to digesting in terms of destination data, visitor economy data, all of those rankings, the ICCA stuff and everything else. But it also includes all of the livability rankings, it includes all of the productivity rankings, it includes the sustainability rankings, all pushed together through one algorithm. And what you end up with is this kind of interesting map or chart, this scatter map of cities. So right in the middle, what have you got? What we call the Big Seven, the cities that were, in a sense, the leading cities of the last two business cycles. The cities that were the corporate headquarters, the finance and business services hubs, the cities that were the command and control centres, the decision-making centres of capitalism from about 1980 through to about 2010. Those cities used their specialisation in the industries that were globalising at that time to develop this dominant position as the de facto global cities. Now, all of you also know that those cities have run into problems, right? The problems they've run into are not just to do with congestion, not just to do with affordability, particularly affordability of housing because of the commercialization of the housing stock, but also challenges around security, challenges around adapting to climate change, and challenges in transitioning towards a new kind of economy. And in a certain way, that group of cities are all of them on a journey from being primarily seen as corporate and financial headquarters to trying to become something else too. And business events, lo and behold, are one of the catalytic tools that they use to try to segue somewhere else. So just think about all of the events that you know that New York and London and Singapore have hosted over the last couple of years. Just think about them for a minute. How many times does the word technology appear? How many times does the word innovation appear? How many times does the word enterprise appear? How many times does the word digital appear? They're using business events to reposition their proposition so that they're no longer thought about solely as corporate headquarters or financial hubs, but they're thought about as cities with more diverse economies. The second group in the concentric circle are called the contenders. These are the cities that are on their way to becoming global decision-making centres in one way or another. They're trying to cluster together command and control activities, decision-making activities. Generally speaking, they're recognising that they have to build a brand, and that brand strongly leverages a visitor economy brand in order to establish a dominant position in talent attraction and retention. In other words, if you want to be a global city like New York and Hong Kong and Singapore, you have to learn how to be attractive to the world's top talent. So that's why Sydney and Madrid and Boston and Munich and Stockholm and all of the others are developing an agenda around bring us the talent. Show the world that we're capable of doing this too. On the right-hand side, you see a very large cluster of cities that are the major gateway cities in the fastest growing economies of the world. These are the cities that are sometimes referred to, the gateways to global opportunity. These are the cities that are the junction boxes into the fastest growing markets. For most of these cities, the challenge is one, catching up with population growth. Most of them have had rapid population growth that surpassed their capacity in terms of their housing system, their education system, their health system, their transport system. So they are rapidly building hard infrastructure and social infrastructure. But at the same time, they're trying to capture a share of globally mobile traded activity. So they're paying a lot of attention to their business climates, and they're trying to build visibility and brand. So just like the group of cities that we call the contenders, they're using business events strategically to make themselves visible to globally mobile talent, capital, firms, events, and opportunities, and using business events, as it were, as a way of introducing themselves to the world so that they can become part of this global system of trading connected cities. Looking over to the left-hand side, you see an entirely different group of cities. So whilst the group in the middle are more or less 5 million to 10 million cities, and the group on the right-hand side are more or less 10 million to 25 million cities, the group on the left-hand side are 5 million or less. And what distinguishes this group of cities is three things. One, they tend to be cities where there's a reputation for a very high quality of life, and it's often associated with their proximity to wonderful natural assets. Coastal areas, lakes, mountains, rivers, beautiful parks, forests, everything else. And they're seen as cities that have a quality of life or a work-life balance proposition that's to die for. The great places to live. These are the cities that frequently score the high marks on the livability indexes, but they don't score so highly usually on the productivity indexes, so they're here. The second thing that marks them out is that they tend to be well-managed cities, well-run cities. Usually a single metropolitan area, 2, 3, 4 million people, good management of transport, good management of housing market, tend to have very good public services, so they're thought of as well-run, and they have to keep that. And thirdly, their economies are increasingly specialising in not the finance and professional services or the corporate headquarters, but they're specializing in the sectors that are being enabled by the new generation of technologies. So they specialize in digital, they specialize in environmental, they specialize in healthcare, education, culture, creativity, those new industries that are rapidly globalizing in this cycle. Now for them, the challenge is very interesting. They have to, on the one hand, keep this high quality of life proposition, because that's the way they attract and retain talent. And at the same time, they have to be really competitive in the small number of global sectors in which they want to specialize in order to be global leaders. And they have to combine that with managing growth in such a way that they don't start to attract the problems of the other cities that have been faster growing. So quality of life is their edge, and specialization in technology-enabled industries is what makes them competitive. So for them, business events play a really critical role in enabling them to enlarge their innovation systems, their supply chains, to show off their talent, to enable their learned institutions to become much more visible to a corporate world, to build, as it were, a supply and demand equation around their specialization that enables them to really succeed. The point I'm trying to make, and I think it's obvious, is that in this middle portion of the urban century, different kinds of cities are emerging. Those different kinds of cities have different models of success, and they can only succeed if they appropriately use the catalysts and the tools at their disposal to develop their success model. And the hosting of business events is one of those success models, one of those catalysts, but it plays different roles in different cities for different purposes. And it's thinking that through that is the key idea behind most of what I'm going to say. Now, I'm not going to give you a very long lecture about climate change because you've had it at least once already. But the key point to make is really that climate change has emerged very rapidly, as Jeff said very clearly at the beginning, of not just the key challenge of our time, but also the key challenge in which the cities wish to take a lead. And more than ever, this is the climate resilience slide, this is the 600 cities that are vulnerable to flooding if we get to 2 degrees of global warming by 2050. So 600 cities, including lots of cities you know, right? Many cities that you're based in. So climate change appears to cities, on the one hand, as a threat. They're going to burn, they're going to flood, they're going to have pandemics, they're going to have high levels of asphyxiation, they're going to have lung diseases, they're going to have young people growing up breathing air that is bad for their health. So it appears as a risk, but it also appears as a strategic opportunity for them to focus on and for them to deliver change around by committing themselves to becoming zero carbon cities. These are the cities that have already made commitments to become net zero carbon and are attempting to lead the way, as it were, in establishing their agenda around how net zero carbon is not just a way, as it were, of arresting climate change, but it's also a catalyst for many other kinds of reforms and innovations and experiments that they wish to take. So they know how to define what carbon neutrality is, what net zero carbon is. They know what is required to decarbonize the city, what is required in real estate, in transportation, in energy, in locations, in industry, what is required in waste and in materials. There is now a road plan that is, as it were, fully marked out for how the cities can lead the process of decarbonizing the world and trying to arrest climate change. And if you like, the detailed thinking that's been done here is at a greater level, as it were, a greater, more granular level than has been done for any of the individual nation states. And you can see the benefits of this zero carbon story very clearly understood, not just in terms of saving the planet, but of improving quality of life, of spawning new innovation, of creating jobs, of investing in the right kinds of infrastructures. As it were, the positive side effects of tackling climate change is that we get good urbanization in the process. That's really why cities have been so key in focusing upon this. It's worth $100 trillion in terms of investment, so it commands the attention of the business community as well. not just the large capital allocators and investors who are very interested in this, but all sorts of other businesses who want to be the innovators in urban technologies, in mobilities, in clean real estate, in all of those other things that we'll come back to in a few minutes. And you can see that 50% of this is going to be in Asia Pacific in terms of investment. The return on the 100 trillion is going to be about 140 trillion in terms of what happens in terms of returns and savings achieved. And the insurance industry, of course, is right at the heart of this conversation. Now, I said earlier that part of the story about this century is the story about digital technologies and what we call the fourth industrial revolution. And this one bringing with it, starting in 1980, but now in 2020, a series of rapidly maturing technologies that are now being widely used in all sorts of market environments. We'll talk a bit more about those in a minute. But this profound change, alongside the urbanisation, the decarbonisation, the digitisation, these are the three key drivers of the century that we're in. And the ability to use these technologies well, to bring them to market maturity, is the key space race of our time in terms of business. Again, you don't need a lecture from me about what's interesting and different about the fourth industrial revolution, but I do want to draw your attention just to this fifth point. It's very easy to think of digitisation as a process of automating everything. That suddenly you get the automated city, the automated vehicle, the autonomous house, yes? Everything becomes a robot that does not so much what you want it to do, but what it understands you wanted it to do through pre-programming. Actually, I think there's a big misunderstanding about what digitisation does, and this is important for us because this is a key part of the experience economy of the century that we're in, which we'll talk about shortly, where I believe business meetings, business gatherings, business events are a key part of a new kind of offering. In other words, it's the ability to customize, to co-create, to curate, the way that digital platforms enable us to cooperate and to innovate that's more important than how these digital platforms enable us to automate and to predict. Again, I'm not going to give you a lecture on technologies because that would be boring for you, but right in the middle are these kind of breakthrough enabling technologies of our time. This slide took me about a year to write, but I think it's a useful slide if you want it all summarised. The big breakthrough technologies of our time are in the middle on the top. On the left-hand side, the scientific implications of those technologies, the ways in which they have sped up our process of discovery in genomics, in alternative fuels, in earth sciences, material sciences, the invention of graphene, the discovery of other kinds of battery technologies. All of these new applications of our time have been greatly assisted by the growth of those technologies. And on the right-hand side, you see the specific features, as it were, of the digital technologies and how they're used really to infuse both markets and other systems. In the middle, what you see is the current set of market applications. It's the same group again of maturing technologies that now define the world that we're in. On the right-hand side, you see me identifying, as it were, how this is changing urban economies. What's different in urban economies as a result of this? The innovation economy, we know all about that, the commercialization of knowledge and technology in all sorts of ways. The experience economy, as it were, the alternative to the online economy, the offline economy, but one that is now focused on a curated experience which is customized, personalized, face-to-face, a memorable moment, an exchange that's spontaneous, an experience that feels rich, real, and authentic. The experience economy grows because of the digitization of routine activities. And therefore, when you go to a business meeting, to a conference, a congestion, you're looking for an experience that is different to the experience you would have had in the past. Just like when you allocate a bit of your free time to go and spend some time in wilderness, or to spend some time in a favorite place, or to have a cultural experience, the premium on your experience of face-to-face, or what we might call face-to-place, has become a much more important aspect of our lives. So experience economy is growing. We'll see that a bit more in a minute. And you can see where the circular economy now rapidly rising as a way of reusing resources, the cradle-to-cradle idea. So urban economy manifestations key, but also city systems applications, if you like, what's sometimes called the smart city or the future city or the intelligent city or the digital city. All of these different ways in which technology is helping us to have better cities. What that means, of course, is that we have to have digitized meetings. We have to have smart business meetings in just the way that we're trying to have smart cities. I want to jump ahead a little bit now and just talk about some of the new clusters of activity that are emerging. This, I think, is relevant particularly to the business meetings agenda, because what we see is a new set of dynamic clusters emerging where there is a high premium on the face-to-face interaction as a driver of innovation, of value creation, of enterprise, and of investment and venturing. So very quickly, before the 1980s, we never talked about financial services. We talked about banking, insurance, pensions, accountancy, and in the 1980s, new trading technologies arrived that enabled us to see how we could allocate capital quickly between these different sectors, and suddenly a supercluster emerged that we now call financial services, and we've forgotten we ever didn't call it financial services, right? The same thing happened in the 1990s with creative industries. Before design technologies were widely used in industrial applications, we thought about fashion and music and food and TV and graphic design and architecture as being all separate industries. Computer-assisted design emerged, and suddenly these industries started to come together in a supercluster. Well, I think the same thing is now happening in 3 other superclusters, and I think that business events, just as they were critical in the clustering of financial services in the 80s and 90s, and just as they were critical in the evolution of creative industries in the 90s and the 2000s, business events, the face-to-face experience of knowledge exchange, co-innovation, joint venturing, design, development, debating of regulations, rules, global standards. What business events apply is the acceleration of this process of building new superclusters. So the first one is urban services. This will be obvious from what I've been saying. The world is urbanizing. That's creating a global industry in the planning, the building, the making, and the management of cities. That global industry is then taking engineering, mobility, architecture, planning, infrastructure, and the rest of them, and beginning to integrate them into a new global supercluster. Why do we have so many conferences at the moment about city building, city making, city management? Because it's becoming a globally traded cluster, which it didn't used to be. So that's why, I mean, I don't know how many of these you're involved with, but I must get 5 emails a day inviting me to come to a conference of this kind about these sorts of subjects. So it's really growing very rapidly. The second one is the experience economy, the merger, as it were, of retail, entertainment, hospitality, well, retail's written twice there, education, culture, tourism, healthcare. This is, as it were, your home cluster, right? It's the cluster where visitation meets education, meets knowledge exchange, meets entertainment, meets hospitality, and meets some kind of generation of new ideas, this experience economy. But it's also an economy that supports the evolution of these other clusters because it provides an additional set of exchanges that make them possible. So this is becoming a new supercluster of our time, very much supported by the drive to have, as I said earlier, an offline experience as well as an online experience. The third one is the circular economy, for all of the reasons that Jeff outlined at the start and I've tried to pick up on. Global concern about the climate emergency is not just, as it were, leading us to regulate and to change behaviours and to incentivize difference. It's actually leading to a whole new industrial sector of innovation around the use and reuse of resources. And the use and reuse of resources is becoming a massive growth engine in the global economy. It's important for cities, but it's also important in all other parts of the world, and you can see where that's working. So my prediction is, if you want to put it at its simplest, these 3 superclusters are the superclusters where you'll see 75–80% of the business meetings of the next 10 years will be somehow in these arenas. Because these are the ones that are rapidly integrating, they're globalizing, these are the ones that cities are competing to be leaders in, these are the ones where capital is starting to flow, these are the ones where the new venture models exist. Hope this makes sense. I think another way to think about what I've been talking about is that different kinds of cities at different speeds go through different cycles of development. Some of you have seen this slide before. It's very simple. What it basically says is that as cities evolve and develop, they start to think about how they engage with their own development through what we might call observable cycles. So in cycle one, when a city is thinking about its future for the first time, it often does physical renewal projects, or it starts to talk about, how can we get some tourists to come to the city, or it starts to think about why it might host its first gathering or event, or it starts to think about foreign direct investment. If you like, it's kind of cycle one urban development, usually involves these things, often led by a visionary public sector with a visionary leader attached to it. And they try to do these things, and tourism becomes the way, if you like, of communicating the brand of the city. In the second cycle, the cities start to specialise. They get very good at these things, and they start to think about how to take it further. So they move away from thinking just about tourism. They start to build a city brand. They start to develop more complex, larger events, start to think about how they can use this activity to generate entrepreneurship. They shift from thinking about the physical renewal of the city to thinking much more about the economy of the city, how they can use it to generate jobs. In the third cycle, if you like, what cities do is start to think about, well, how do we manage the consequences of doing this well? How do we get diversification? How do we manage growth? How do we allocate different industries to different areas? How do we expand our housing market? How do we start to develop, as it were, a metropolitan area idea so that we're bringing our neighbouring authorities into it? They start to think about how to be not so much good in one sector, but how to be business friendly. Not so much how to promote one project, but how to be open to investment more widely. They start to think not just about what event can we host, but which summits can we become associated with. They start to develop a more complex and sophisticated idea about themselves in the world, and they have a set of initiatives, strategies, agencies, and events that go with that. And then in the fourth cycle, cities start to think about managing the consequences of the success that all of this brings. How to deal with the overcrowding, how to deal with the over-tourism, how to deal with the inflated housing market, how to put in place new city systems that enable them to manage growth, but also how to continue to become much more specialised around the industries in which they're now focusing, how to build a nuanced ecosystem in them, how to develop, as it were, their own events, their own global identity, their own self-identified branded activities, and they move on in that way. The only reason I'm giving you this ABC of city development is to make two rather obvious points. It makes sense for cities to understand which cycle they're in, because the choices that that city makes in terms of what they do next should be governed by the opportunities and challenges of the next cycle, not be governed by the habits and the patterns of the previous cycle. So one of the problems that cities get into is repeating the thing that worked 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years ago, rather than realizing what they do is to move on to the thing that they need to do next. That's the first thing. And the second thing I want to say to you that's very obvious is that the role that business events play in the development of the city changes from one cycle to another. The nature of the business events that the city should host change, and their ability to utilize business events effectively evolves as they go through this kind of cycle. Right, let's jump along. One way of explaining in a more simple way what I've just been saying is to take an example of a few cities. 3 cities, all rather different cities. Think about what that city has done in the last 20, 30, 40 years in terms of its own agenda for its own development. Think about the stages they have gone through. So here's Singapore, 1964, poor island, post-colonial economy, small population, no resources, no industry. What do? Stabilise the population and the public services, make sure they have access to fresh water, begin to develop their story around water innovation. They move from that into becoming a hub of low cost but relatively high value manufacturing. That creates public resources, it creates jobs, it builds a balance sheet for the island. That enables them to start investing again in public services and really growing them up. They move from manufacturing to advanced manufacturing, start to build the technology dimension, the talent dimension. They become open to investment from lots of other places. From advanced manufacturing, they shift very rapidly into business services. Business services are then accompanied by finance, and they become a services hub, providing services not just, as it were, to global firms that were locating there through the FDI period, but starting, as it were, to become an influential city for ASEAN, for Asia in particular, a launch base, a landing pad, as it were, to get into that. They move from that focus on finance and services into science and technology, strong focus on medicine, nanotechnology, leadership and innovation, and eventually you get to the Singapore we have today, soft power, global leadership, lots of examples of leading the innovation process across lots of sectors and lots of global governance concerns. So all I want you to do is think about, okay, well, what's the role of business events in that journey? That journey of 5 cycles in more or less 50, 60 years, shifting dramatically through different kinds of industrial compositions, through different kinds of infrastructure platforms, and through different kinds of hard power, soft power, influence, leadership, business attraction. Business events played a key role as catalysts in marking those processes of success and then signaling the next cycle of change that was about to occur, building a brand for Singapore as being a self-determining nation, and establishing through Singapore, as it were, a soft power around how to become a city, how to become a successful city, and how to do that at a global scale with global reach. Let's leave that to one side. Last point I want to make is that, of course, whilst it's easy to compare cities in the way I did right at the start, cities, of course, all have an individual and unique DNA. This is not just, as it were, a metaphor that says that every city's got a genetic code and you've got to, as it were, decode the city, and if you can do that, you can align with the DNA. All of that's true. But cities have a literal DNA, an architecture, an infrastructure platform, a geography, a history, a social biography, a DNA of their population that shapes and affects the character of the city, what the city is able to do, how it aspires, how it embraces change, how it exercises its own leadership. So if you're thinking about the business events program for a particular city, understanding the DNA of that city and how you align with it becomes very clear. I want to talk just for a few minutes about Australia and New Zealand cities. As you can see here, a bit of the core data around what the cities are. But I want to in particular remind you that Australia and New Zealand are 2 of the most highly urbanised nations in the world. It's easy to forget that. But to make the point that they're very strongly clustered in this group of cities I was talking to you about before, where high quality of life combined with leadership in new sectors enabled by new technologies, coupled with a well-managed city, a well-managed region, is part of the appeal. So you have to always look at a brand or a story or the identity of city as both an opportunity but also a risk. If you fail to align with what's there, if you corrupt the success model, you can end up going backwards, as Milan and Moscow and Mumbai and a few other cities contend. So very interesting. And I think if you start to think about this system of cities in Australia and New Zealand and where the different cities are in a kind of 4 cycles approach, thinking about the industrial composition of these cities, then I think you can start to think in the way I was just explaining how business events can play a role in the transition through various kinds of value chains towards a high-value economy and all that that brings with it. Same story really for ASEAN. People in the room from the ASEAN countries, the 26 cities in the ASEAN Cities Network, beginning to develop their approach. Really different kinds of cities here. We've had the Singapore story for a few minutes. Look at where the other cities are, look at what they're doing, think about their imperatives, start to think about the role of business events in helping those cities move from one stage of their development through to another. Let's do the same thing with Greater China. Easy to do here as well. Starting to think about what the cities are doing, how they're spread, what's the next agenda for each of those cities, where do business events fit in in terms of those cities moving through their own development cycles, finding their potential, exploiting, as it were, what they can be. Same story for Manat in the Middle East. Here they are, 23 cities growing very fast, 28 of the 30 largest cities in Manat expected to have more than 15% growth, the most rapidly urbanizing region of the world. You can see the levels of urbanization here, but increasingly you can see once again how these cities are moving. This helps you to understand why Dubai, for example, has been such a champion of business events, why business events have been so critical on Dubai's journey, as it were, from a fishing village where people dived for pearls, through its strategy of being firstly a business centre, then becoming a financial centre, now becoming a tourism hub, but on its way to becoming a centre of global innovation, which of course is what it always was. So this way of thinking allows you to see beyond the current cycle and think about what Dubai might be in the future, why therefore it's hosting the World Expo and what it's going to do by having the World Expo. We can get to the point where we recognise that the journey to having a new economy or the journey to becoming net zero carbon start to actually be the same journey in terms of embracing innovation in favour of a more sustainable model, a more diversified model, a model that fits with the size and the capability of the city. So how to wrap this up? I think there are a set of implications here for people who are in the business of promoting business events. Rather obvious what they are. You need to understand the DNA of your city. You need to know what cycles it's on. You need to know what the strategic goals are. Where has it been? Where is it going? What's your role in the journey of the city? Becomes rather obvious, and many people in the room know this very well. Know the city governance system. Know where its points of influence are. Know how to tell your story into that system. Form a strong team of industry leaders so that the business events industry is well organised, articulate, sensitive, clubbable, has emotional intelligence as well as having intellectual intelligence. Optimise the impact, build the evidence base. You're all doing that anyway. Connect the meetings that you host to the leadership agenda of the city. You're all doing that anyway. Support other contests that the city's involved in. Help the city to win other things, as well as the events that you want to win, because then you become part of the team of the city, rather than something that might be seen as a parasite in the city, for example, which of course you're not. Bring business leadership and bring other business groups into dialogue with the city, so that the conversation that the city's having about its own future gets a broader audience and a broader set of participation through your work. And then I think there's 7 things that cities could do to really optimise and leverage business meetings much better. Recognise the nature of the high-value sectors we've been talking about, the 3 new superclusters, where innovation, face-to-face, discourse, discussion, rule setting, standard setting, showcasing, joint venturing, co-creation, all of those things that are part of the innovation process, those things are happening in those 3 superclusters right now. That's where business events are part of the development of the innovation process in the city. Make sure as city leaders that you recognise business events are catalysts for this kind of change and for sustainability, rather obvious. Give high strategic priorities to the business events industry. Tell them what you want them to do. Understand the industry clusters that we've just been talking about, and who are the suppliers, what's the ecosystem, what's its impact. Cities obviously need to solve hosting problems very actively. They need to make the welcome very personal. And they need to prepare hosting facilities that are for 21st century meetings, not the 19th century meetings. I think you know what I mean. But if you think about that process of co-creation and innovation, the kinds of venues, the kinds of events we're talking about don't look much like the conventions and exhibitions and summits and expositions of the past. They look much more like a process of leaders, innovators, inventors, entrepreneurs and investors gathering together to do something together, rather than, as it were, to participate simply in a debate. So I hope this has been useful. What I've been trying to say to you is that we're living in a very interesting century. We're getting towards being halfway through. We're certainly in the middle third. We can now see how urbanisation is playing out. We can see why the climate emergency has become critical to address as urbanisation completes its process. We have a new set of technologies that are helping us to do that. They're giving rise to a new set of economic opportunities in which cities want and need to specialise. In order to do that specialisation and to decarbonise, they need a series, a sequence of capable, competent business events to make it possible for them to do that. I hope that's clear. Thank you very much for listening.